All right. Today I'm walking around in Gangnam and I want to talk about coding and AI. Um, I have a bunch of thoughts around this. So this is kind of in no particular order. I'm just going to share. So um, this past few days I've been coding with AI and it's it's kind of wild. It's like going back to my coding history. I remember in high school, I wanted to learn computer programming. This is in the early 2000s, like 2001, 2002. And the only way to code was to learn like C++. And I remember I went to the bookstore and bought a book for to learn C++. And I looked at it, and I had no idea what it meant, and I just gave up. I was like, this is not working. Um, so and then many years later I started working at TripAdvisor as a product manager, and there I was working with developers. But in order to get that job, at the time in 2012, 2013, if you wanted to be a product manager, you needed previous coding experience. But that's what a lot of them look for. And so I was like, well, if I want to get that job, I gotta learn how to code. So my MBA program had a coding class, and I remember I just dived straight in, and I was spending so many hours. We were learning Ruby on Rails, and the big thing that I learned about coding was two things. Number one, Stack Overflow is your friend. If you didn't know how to do anything, you just go to Stack Overflow and just type in your question, and oftentimes someone has already asked that question, and you can hopefully sift through the answers and find your answer. That's the first thing. The second thing was I learned that the benefit of having a product manager role. So an example was I remember I was coding something. I was trying to use add a feature where you can log in via Google, and I was spending so many hours, like 5, 7 hours, and I was banging my head against the wall. I couldn't find a good answer on Stack Overflow, and you were assigned a pair programmer, so you had to code with somebody else. And so I was talking to my pair programmer, and she looked at me as I was explaining the problem to her, and she said, "Why are you working on this? I don't think you need this." And I was like, "No, of course I think I need this." And I thought about it. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I don't need this." I was blown away, and that's when I realized that there is a legitimate role when you go diving into something, especially coding, but really a lot of anything, just any job, writing, marketing, anything. If you dive deep, it's often very beneficial to have someone who will help you ask good questions. And so that was one thing I learned. Oh, there was another thing I learned. I learned how quickly you forget coding. I think about a week, I think I dedicated 20, 30, 40 hours of coding. This is on top of the other schoolwork that I was doing. And I thought I learned a lot. But within a week of not coding, I had forgotten maybe 50, 60%. And then within 2 weeks, I forgot 90. Within 3, I forgot almost everything. So I realized how quickly coding atrophies. And so fast forward, it was around 2015, 2016. I was like, you know what? I want to pick up coding again. I want to try it. And I learned Swift, which is a coding language for iOS, like iPhones and iPads and whatnot. And one thing that I realized was, number one, it was taking me an enormous amount of energy to learn how to code everything. And number two, I think I couldn't justify it. I had a wife, I had kids, and I'm like, I'm spending this enormous amount of time, and what am I going to get from it? It's a better use of my time to study an industry, learn about my product management or something. So I just kind of relegated myself to saying, okay, there's nothing I can do. All right, well, fast forward, ChatGPT, and then I'd heard snippets that it could code. So I'm like, okay, well, let's take a look. I remember it was around February of 2023. I had heard inklings that ChatGPT can help you code. So I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna try. And so I wanted to create some app that I can give it a long transcript, like a long text file, and 100 pages. And I wanted it to cut it up into segments of like 10 pages. I needed this for some reason, but anyway, I was like, can I do this? And I didn't even know what language, I don't know what to use. So I just said Python, because I'd heard of Python. A lot of people seem to like Python, so I'm like, all right, let's use Python. And what I would do was I would explain it to ChatGPT, and then it would write the code for me. And then I would copy that code. I would go into this other app called Replit, and Replit is where you can write code and it deploys it for you. Deploying meaning you can put it in a public space so everybody has access to it. It's kind of like on Google Docs, where you can keep it private, or you can change the sharing so that you can share it with anyone who has a link. So it's kind of like that. Okay, so it didn't work the first time around. There were errors. I didn't know what to do, so I got the errors. I just like copied the errors and pasted it back into ChatGPT, and I said, hey, there were these errors, what do I do? And so it just told me what to do. And I did this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it was about 2 hours. It took me about 2 hours. And I ended up with a Python script that could do what I wanted it to do. And I remember what it made me feel. It blew my mind that I had created a Python script to do a task that I had to do manually, and it had done it for me without me understanding how to code, and it just did it for me. And I was blown away. And my mind immediately started racing to what the implications of this was. Because if you think about it, coding is such a sought after profession because it's such a hard skill to learn. And yet it is so valuable. So the demand for people who can code is very high, and the supply is not that high, because traditionally you either have to become a computer science major, 4 years of university and then several internships, or the other way is, if you're switching careers, you could go to what they call a coding boot camp. So it would be all intensive. Basically, you have to quit your job and do this all intensive boot camp where it was like 5 hours a day, 6 plus. I mean, that's just instruction. And then you have your homework and you're coding with other people who are coding. And you're putting in like 10, 12 hours a day. And you do that for 3 months. And then you learn how to build apps, and then that's the other way to get into the software development space. But until then, software was taking over the world. So anyone who knew how to code, you had job security. But remember, that was in a world where humans were the only way of coding something. But I just had finished a Python script, and I didn't know how to code. But I knew clearly what I wanted to do. So this blew my mind, and it's like, oh my gosh, what does this mean for the future of software development? And let's say that coding becomes easier and easier. Then, I can start coding, and now I don't have to hire a software engineer. If I have some patience, then, I can become a coder. I don't have to hire or outsource my development to a $10,000, workshop. So, but then I stopped doing it. I think it was because it's like, I can create simple apps, but I don't know. It was just, you can create like a simple app, like an app that tells you what the weather is. Like, those are pretty easy. But when you start getting into more complex apps, like it's hard. And then I wanted to add the ability for different users to create accounts. It's called user authentication. To let them create an account and log in. But then it starts getting super complicated. I'm like, I don't know how to do this. So I kind of just paused it. And then starting about, I don't know, I'd say like 2 months ago, I started on Twitter seeing this guy who was getting really into it. He was getting really into coding, and he's not a coder, but he gave himself a goal where he's like, I want to be a senior like software engineer or something really quickly. And so I started seeing some of his content, and I'm like, wow, that's he's like coding a bunch of stuff. He's coding not only web apps, but he's coding iPhone apps, like iOS apps. And I'm like, whoa, this is nuts. This is crazy. And the way that he was doing it was he was using this software called Cursor AI. Now, Cursor AI I had heard about 6 months ago, It's an IDE, and I don't know what the I stands for, but the DE stands for developer environment. Basically, for you to code, you have to use an app. And so, it's that app. Imagine it's like Google Docs, right? For writing your essay, IDE is what you use to write code. So, but this IDE was different because it had AI baked in. See, one of the big problems, one of the annoying parts was even if you write code in ChatGPT, you have to copy that code and then you have to paste it back into your IDE. And if there's an error, you have to copy that error and bring it back into ChatGPT. It's just so much back and forth. So what Cursor AI did was bring ChatGPT into the IDE. So you can, let's say, highlight a certain set of code. Like, you have 100 lines of code, you highlight first 20, and you're like, can you explain what this code does? Because I have no idea what this does. And they'll start explaining it to you. So it does that. So I had messed with it a while back, and I was like, that's really impressive. Well, once again, one of the challenges is when you create an app, you often have multiple files. You have one file that kind of shows you how it looks, which is they call it often is the index.html file. So that's like how the website will look. And then the brains of it, how the app actually works, you'll have maybe another file of like game.js, JavaScript or whatever. The problem was, if you worked with an AI, it would tell you, hey, you need to create 3 different files. An HTML file, a JavaScript file. And so you have to go in and create it. And you have to copy and paste the code in it. And then as you're doing the back and forth, the AI might forget what you're building. And then it'll mess everything up. And I'm just like, because I remember doing this, I'm like, oh, this is such a pain, I stopped it. But recently, I think a few months ago, they released a new update called Cursor Composer. And so what Cursor Composer does now is it's almost like having a AI software developer. So Cursor Developer brings AI into your IDE, but also it can create the files for you. So instead of me getting confused and creating, I'm like, what, create what file? I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And then if there's an issue, I'm like, I don't know which file to look into. Cursor Composer, you just explain to it in plain English, and you say, hey, I want to create an app that tracks what I eat, as an example. Then what'll happen is it'll say, got it. It'll create a plan and it'll think about what the files it needs. So it's like, okay, I'll create an HTML file, I'll create another file, and then I'll create the JavaScript file. Here I go. And then it starts creating all those files and all the code. And this is where kind of like my mind was blown. I was like, oh my gosh. And that's crazy. So we're now getting closer to a point where I can just type. And actually, I wasn't even typing. There's this app. It's called, I think it's Whisperflow. But basically, it's just voice dictation. But it's really good. It just works really well. But you do voice dictation. And so I literally am just talking to my computer. I'm just like, hey, I'd like to create an app that can track the weather. Can you do that for me? And then it'll start creating it. And then for those of you who are interested in actually doing this, the ID is where the code is. But for you to get that code, I'm using 2 more tools. One is called GitHub. So GitHub is basically, it's kind of like Dropbox. So I'll write the code, I'll save it, but it's on my computer. But I need it somewhere like on the internet. So somewhere in the cloud, like Dropbox. So I'll push it to GitHub, and the nice thing about GitHub is it saves it in the cloud, so anyone can access it, or anyone I want to give it access to, similar to Google Docs. The other thing that's really good about it is that it can copy, it's very similar to Google Docs actually. It can, it keeps track of all the different versions. So if I, let's say, made a bunch of changes, I saved it, and then I made a bunch of changes, and then the app broke. Now I want to go back. Well, you can revert back to the previous version. Now these are things that we obviously have had for Google Docs. I don't know if all of you know, but Google Docs, it does capture all the versions. And GitHub does a very similar thing. Okay, so now I made the weather app. The Cursor Composer just created it. Great. By the way, Cursor Composer is like $20 a month. Totally worth it. And so create the code. And now I synced it to GitHub, and I pushed the changes to GitHub, so I'm syncing it. So now it's in GitHub. So now it's in my, Google Docs. Now it's in my, my Dropbox. That thing. The next step is you can't just show the code to everybody. That's just holding the code. You need another service to push that out to the internet. So now it's available for everybody. And there's a lot of services out there that do that. Right now, I'm just using a service called Netlify, Netlify. I'm using it because I've heard a bunch of people use it, and I hear it's free, so I'm like, why not? So that's what happens. So what's the nice thing about Netlify is you can log in with your GitHub account, which is what I did. Log in with Google, log in with GitHub. And then it asks, do you want to authorize Netlify to access GitHub? The answer is yes. The reason you want to say yes is because if Netlify can access your code files in GitHub, well, that means that Netlify can get that code and post it so that everyone in the world can use it. Now, what does that mean? What that means is it's really cool. So for me, let's say I want to change the color of the background to blue. I'll go into Cursor, I'll go to Cursor Composer, I'll use my voice dictation app, so I'll just be like, hey, the background's currently white, I want to change it to blue. And then it'll look up the appropriate files, and it'll auto-magically update the files. I'll save it. I'm like, great, I like it. I want to push the changes to GitHub. And once I do that, GitHub file gets updated. The nice thing here is Netlify, because they have access to GitHub, they notice that there's a newer version. There's a newer version of that code in GitHub. It automatically pulls that change and then updates the website. So it's super nice. All I have to do is make the changes in Cursor. I save it, I send the changes to GitHub, and it'll automatically update the website. So why is this important? My hypothesis, and I think a lot of people share this understanding with me, is that coding is becoming democratized. Democratized meaning more people can do it. More people, not just a select group of artisans, more people can do it. An analogy I have is back in the 1850s when the Industrial Revolution happened. Before the Industrial Revolution, before all these machines, in order for you to, let's say, make a t-shirt, you had to be an artisan. You had to learn the trade. You had to be an apprentice. It took you years to figure it out. I don't know, just as an example. And then maybe you can make one t-shirt a day. But only people who had learned the trade could become t-shirt makers. But after the invention of the machine essentially automated a lot of that. So not only can it go faster, not only can it make more t-shirts per day than a human, another key thing that it did is it democratized the ability to make t-shirts. Now anybody who can afford to buy a machine, they can make a t-shirt at the push of a button. So the type of people that can create t-shirts significantly increase. Now anyone who can learn how to press a button on the machine can become a t-shirt maker. I think the same thing's happening with coding. We're using these machines called AI, and then we just describe to them what we want, and then it makes it. And I wanted to test this concept. So yesterday, my daughter I kind of messed with creating a game with her. She's in the third grade, and we did it many, like last year. But I'm like, hey, I want to try this again. Now that I have Cursor Composer, now that I have GitHub, Netlify, let's try it. Sure enough, we were just talking. I was like, what do you want to build? And my daughter said, I want to build a jumping game. So I said, okay, let's build a jumping game. And Cursor Composer created the code, and then we pushed the code to GitHub. GitHub saved it. Netlify noticed the changes. It pushed it so that now everyone can access it. And then right after she made it, she was like, oh my gosh, look, the game is there. And then my son, who's in 7th grade, jumps in and is like, hey, I'll play it. So I sent the link on our family messages a group, and then he was playing on his iPad, and he noticed that the game was going really slow. So I was like, okay, Adeline, I want you to create a list of things that you want to change. So she's like, I want to add like a leaderboard with the most recent 10 high scores. We have an issue with the iPad. It runs really slow. On desktop, it's okay. And so we talked to Composer. Composer then updated all the files. We pushed the changes to GitHub, and then it automatically updated, and Netlify was like, hey, here's a new website. And so we only did like 30 minutes of it yesterday. But what this is reminding me of is, oh my gosh, like we're getting to the point, I mean, we're basically there right now, where I can have an idea in my head. Then I can speak it and communicate it through voice. It'll turn that voice into text, and then it will make the changes to the code, and it will create an app. There's some bigger ramifications of what I think this means for society, for what it means to be a software developer. I think a lot more people who have great ideas, they're great at marketing, they just can't code, they will start making their own apps. And then you'll start seeing across the industry a lot more apps, because now the cost to make an app is like an hour of your time instead of like, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000. So I also spent the weekend learning how to code, and the reason was, it was two reasons. Number one, it was fun. I just felt my energy going there. I'm just like, you know what, I'm gonna do it, it's fun. But the other reason was, I wanted to see how much things had progressed in only like half a year. And I'm realizing, man, it progressed a lot. But the other thing is, lately I've been thinking about, how can businesses use AI to save a bunch of money and build a lot of value? A lot of them, seriously, they can just use ChatGPT. Another competitor is Anthropic Claude. Claude's really good, I use that. There's Perplexity. I use Perplexity to do any searches that you have to search on the internet. So there's all these tools that you can just use. But there comes a point where you would rather use something that's custom created, that can access your company's database, and it doesn't share it, or you don't want the data to go to other companies, you just want to keep it within your company. So then you have to start creating maybe custom apps. And I knew in theory that you can use AI for a bunch of these scenarios, but I felt like my knowledge, there was a gap of like, how could this actually work? And I'm an experiential learner. And so I realized, you know what? I just need to kind of roll up my sleeves and get it done. And so that's another reason why I started coding, because I want to now understand, how could I actually implement AI to solve problems for myself? And what I'm realizing is just, I think I'm just gonna, going back to the whole ROI calculation. Before I would say, ROI it's not there. The return on investment, if I invest 10 hours to learn code, I'm gonna forget it in like a day. And it's just not worth it. Now, the information doesn't go away as fast, because I'm not learning actually how to code. I'm just like learning what tools I need to use in what order. That's not that hard to figure out. The actual coding itself, the LLM, the AI is doing it. So I'm going to retain this information for a lot longer. And not only that, I can create custom applications that only I can use, or I can build it for my friends and family or clients. So am I becoming a master coder? Not really. My goal is simply to learn enough to be dangerous. Learn enough to like create a prototype, just to show how it really works. And if I got a real customer, either I would have the skills to just create a custom app, or I would know enough where I would be able to hire a developer, but I would know exactly what I would want. Whereas before, like my friend, he had hired a developer and he was not a developer, had no experience with development. And he had a lot of trouble working with a developer because his expectations was this much and they were providing this much. And so if you're able to code and create prototypes, you're now hiring people not to build, to build the whole thing, but you have much more creative control and technical control because you know how these things are built. And you're like, hey, I want to use this language, I want to use this software. In this situation, it has to do this. I want to use this specific service, and this is the documentation that will explain to you how to use it. So it's just a really cool world. It's just a really cool world that we're going into. And yeah, today went a little long, but I just want to kind of share with you kind of my experience with coding. And I would encourage you to also explore this. The cost is not that high. Like I said, you can just start off with getting Cursor AI, create a free account on Google, sorry, not Google, what am I saying? GitHub, and create this free account on Netlify. And there's a lot of videos online if you can look for it. And you can start coding. You can literally start creating simple apps. But once again, one thing that you have to keep in mind is that this technology is developing at such a fast pace. So right now, you can often just build like simple apps. People are already working on updates where you can create much more complex apps. So you can imagine a future where I could have a team of 3 teams of AI developers. I have another team, an agent that is a marketer, another agent that does something else. So you can have a company. I can be running an AI company that produces more work than a team of humans because they can work 24/7. So it's a wild world. I think the best way to understand this fast evolving world is that you just have to experiment and prototype. And as you do so, you'll start learning what is and what isn't possible. You'll start learning the capabilities and limitations. And from that, you can make better predictions of how your business or the industry can actually use AI. Not just some fantasy sci-fi, but actually. So hope you go out there and have fun. Leave any comments below of questions you have or things that you're trying. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.